Okay, we're going to talk about title and risk of loss. Title deals with the ownership of the goods. Risk of loss deals with who is responsible or who bears the burden when the goods are either damaged or destroyed. So, we're going to deal with looking first at what happens when there are problems in the delivery of the goods and there are no terms in the contract that specify what to do. So if something happens and there are terms in the contract that tell you what is to happen, we follow those. If not, we follow the rules that are governed by the Uniform Commercial Code for Article 2. And in this case, we're mainly dealing with contract carriers, not common carriers. So we're going to look at still the sale of goods, but we're going to deal with circumstances where if something happens to the goods, there's nothing in the contract that provides for what to do. So, what can happen? What are some potential problems? Goods can be lost or destroyed in transit when they're moved from the seller to the buyer, and that deals with the risk of loss. The question becomes, does the buyer have to pay for the goods if they're lost or destroyed in transit? And it depends on, does the buyer have the risk of loss? Has it passed from the seller to the buyer? And then there may be a question also, if there's a creditor of either the buyer or the seller, and the buyer and the seller don't pay the creditor, can the creditor seize or take the goods while they are in transit or in general? And the question depends on who owns the goods or who has title of the goods. The first thing we have to do in order to deal with title and risk of loss is we have to identify the goods. So the question is, how are goods identified? So if the goods are already in existence, which means that they're present at the time of the contract. For example, when I go into a store and pick out a pair of pants, the goods are already present there. They don't have to be made or custom made. At that time, the goods are identified when you have existing goods, when they are picked out, or basically when they're selected by either the seller or the buyer. If you have future goods, which are goods that do not exist at the time of the contract, like if I was ordering a custom made good at the time the contract is made, those goods would not be available. They would have to be made. So, how does identification occur at that time? Identification would occur when they're shipped, marked, or not otherwise designated by the seller. So, once the goods are made, once the seller has designated those goods either by shipping, marking, or identifying those goods, that's how they would be identified. So, they have to be made. So if we have fungible goods, which are goods that don't have a distinguishable part, so like shoes would not be fungible because you'd have a distinguishable pair of shoes. Fungible goods are goods that are not distinguishable. They are homogeneous, like soybeans, like milk. Those goods are identified when they are shipped, marked, or otherwise designated by the seller. So the same way that future goods would be identified. Some important terms. You're going to have non-shipment contracts, which are contracts where there's no requirement for delivery. If you have a requirement for the delivery, which means the seller has to deliver the goods, that's a shipment or delivery contract. Also, there may be a transfer of ownership through a document of title, like a receipt, or if you were to for example, use a warehouse or someone who stores a good, that person would give you a receipt or some type of document for your storage of goods if you were storing those goods, or if you were shipping some goods through FedEx, a common carrier, you would have a receipt. That would be a document of title. So that's something to think about, just as far as what the terms mean. Title means ownership, passing ownership. Just like when we talked about if you have a sale, there has to be a passage of ownership or title. Risk of loss deals with who's responsible for the goods if they are damaged or destroyed. Now, sometimes your title and risk of loss will pass from the seller to the buyer at the same time. Sometimes they will not. So, for example, documents of title, the title and risk of loss will pass at the same time, and also shipment or delivery contracts, title and risk of loss pass at the same time. But they do not pass at the same time when we're dealing with non-shipment or non-delivery contracts. So let's look at title. Again, passage of ownership. So you're looking at when does the ownership pass from the seller to the buyer. If you have a document of title, like an example where somebody actually uses a warehouser, the title will pass when the buyer receives the document of title, like the warehouse. So the buyer will own the goods when he, she, or it receives the document of title. If you have a non-shipment contract, which means there's no requirement for delivery, and unless stated otherwise, the seller does not have a requirement for delivery, the title passes at the time of the contract. If you have a shipment contract with shipping terms, you have to look at what the shipping terms are. And shipment contract only means delivery. The only shipping terms that we're going to deal with are FOB place of destination and FOB place of shipment. So FOB place of destination is a type of shipping term that requires the goods to be tendered or offered at the buyer's location or destination. So the title will pass when the goods are tendered at the buyer's location. So let's say, for example, that we have a contract that says FOB place of destination. Under those circumstances, that means that the shipper has to get the goods to the buyer's destination. And until the goods are at the buyer's destination, the goods are not owned by the buyer. So as far as we looked at earlier, a question about can the creditors get the goods. So if the buyer had creditors and they wanted ownership to those goods to pay the debt that the buyer could not pay, the goods would not be owned by the buyer until they get to the place of destination, because title does not pass for those goods until they're tendered at the buyer's location. For FOB place of shipment, that means that the shipper only has to get the goods to the common carrier. So FOB place of shipment basically means that you have the place of shipment, all the shipper has to do is get the goods to the common carrier or the contract carrier or whoever the carrier is. It's the same rule whether you're dealing with a contract or a common carrier. So title will pass as soon as the seller gets the goods to the carrier's possession. So that's FOB place of shipment. Risk of loss. Risk of loss means who has who bears the damage if the goods are lost or destroyed in transit while they're being transported. And so with the document of title, risk of loss does not pass to the buyer until the buyer receives the document of title. With the shipment contract, the risk of loss passes just like the title. So FOB place of destination, the risk of loss passes when the goods are tendered at the buyer's location. For FOB place of shipment, risk of loss passes when the seller gets the goods in the carrier's possession. So notice that with the document title, like I said earlier, and the shipment, the risk of loss and the passage of title pass at the exact same time. Now, for non-shipment contracts, remember that the title passed at the time of the contract. For non-shipment contracts with risk of loss, you have to ask whether you're dealing with a merchant seller. And if you remember, sometimes you get more protection with a merchant seller than a non-merchant seller. So a merchant seller, the risk of loss will pass when the goods are actually received. So the merchant seller has a greater burden. So the buyer has to receive the goods before the risk of loss actually passes. So even if for example, the merchant calls the buyer and says the goods are ready, that's a tender that they're offering the goods. The risk of loss will not pass until the buyer actually comes to pick up the goods, because remember, it's a non-shipment, so the seller does not have to deliver the goods. Now, if you have a non-merchant seller, risk of loss passes as soon as those goods are ready. So as soon as the seller says, as a non-merchant seller, these goods are ready, the risk of loss will pass. So if the buyer takes a while to pick up the goods, the risk of loss will actually not pass. They will pass, once they're tender and once they're offered. So what I was going to say about the buyer will not have the protection if something happens to those goods after the goods are tendered. So if, for example, the seller calls the buyer and says the goods are ready, and the buyer takes a while to get the goods, and once the goods are ready, something happens to the goods, maybe they are destroyed, the buyer is still going to be responsible for paying for those goods if you have a non-merchant seller, because as soon as the goods are ready and offered to the buyer, the risk of loss passes. That means the buyer now has the burden if something happens to it. So you actually do better if you have a merchant seller, because when the goods are ready or tendered is not the time that the risk of loss passes. It's when the goods are actually received by the buyer or picked up by the buyer. Now, sometimes you have a situation where the seller tenders or offers goods that don't conform with the contract. Now, under Article 2 of the Uniform Commercial Code, there's a perfect tender rule, which means that the goods have to be perfect. They have to be conforming. So if the seller offers goods that are not conforming to the contract, title and risk of loss will not pass. So you have to offer the goods that were actually contracted or agreed to by the contract for title and risk of loss to pass from the seller to the buyer. Some other important points. If you have a stolen property, the finder of stolen property or the thief cannot pass good title. Or basically an easier way of saying that is, if someone steals property, they would have void title. So even if the goods are purchased by someone who doesn't know that the goods were stolen, that void title can never make valid title. So if you buy something from a thief, even if you don't know that it was stolen, you will not get valid title, and the true owner can come back and get the goods. If you buy something that comes from fraud, that's different. Or someone who has voidable title can pass valid title. So let's say that I buy some goods and I actually wrote a bad check. That would mean that I have voidable title. But if I sold those goods to someone who didn't know that I had fraud or that I had that voidable title, which would be a good faith purchaser, that person would have valid title. So what that means is, if the store that I bought the goods from comes back and tries to get those goods from the new owner, they could not. So voidable title can make valid title.